Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Logan Kelly. Logan is a technologist focused on what breaks when AI agents move from demos into production. Logan, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to give a quick introduction about yourself and your company before we get into the topic?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the CEO, small company, so wear a lot of hats. But Waxell AI is a AI agent observability and most importantly governance platform. So really working through how we can run agents safely and be able to sleep when we have agents running in production.
Thank you. That sounds very interesting, and there's plenty to talk about there. So, the topic that we've loosely picked for, at least for today, Logan, is two topics, right? The first one is AI agents are already in production and why most companies have no real control over them. Let's talk about what that means and what you recommend. And the next topic, the second one is from demos to infrastructure, what breaks when AI starts running real workflows. So before we get into each of those, we can start with one or the other. It really doesn't matter to me. Can you give a brief introduction to AI agents and the core service that you're providing? I know you gave an introduction to your product, but if you go into a little bit more detail, probably call out for a problem and just speak to what the current solutions might be and why your offering is actually better and where it does make a difference.
Yeah, sure. So when we when we think about agents versus like software, so with software like cloud software, we've got these great observability tools like Datadog and all of that. And that's where a lot of the kind of tooling in the market has started with. So you build the agent, then you instrument the agent for observability. The problem with agents versus like software is when something goes wrong with an agent, that means that it could continue to go wrong. It could continue to burn tokens. It could be bringing like things like PII into prompts and all of that. And so where we sit at Waxel is how can we how can you sort of not just observe but govern in the sense that if things start to go wrong with an agent, we turn it off. If there's a lot of errors, if there's overburning on tokens, those kinds of things, being able to govern that agent so that you can walk away and know that if something goes wrong, uh, something has your back.
Okay, so that's interesting because it's also important because now that we're talking about AI agents a lot these days, I read somewhere the other day that there's going to be like hundreds of thousands of agents, as we progress and get into more of this technology. So can we take an example, Logan, of a typical agent or either a real one that you've worked on or your product helps, or it could be something that you haven't used necessarily, but just to give our audience a general overview of an agent and maybe a simple one, maybe a complex one, doesn't matter. What are some real problems that you've seen them run into, and what is the interaction that they would potentially have with your platform like Waxell AI so they can actually let their agents be governed?
Yeah. So kind of Waxel was actually born out of a autonomous sales engagement company called CallSign, which is my other company here. And so when you think about where sales engagement has started, right? It's like CRMs, it's tools like SalesLoft, where they're running these really deterministic, templated, first name, insert first name here kind of workflows. And so the agents that we originally built were really focused on, can we go from strategy, working with a user kind of interactively to build the strategy of a sales campaign, going out and building the lists, finding the people through contact databases and all these things, writing the outreach, and then actually sending the outreach and managing the responses. So to do that autonomously, there's a lot of decision making that needs to happen. There's a lot of data that needs to be, kind of ingested. Then, so the first piece, like when you're talking about making a decision that's kind of low risk, but could have implications downstream, like building a contact list and kind of QAing the contacts and being able to say, okay, does this contact fit this outreach campaign? And so when we talk about governance and kind of orchestration and observability in that sense, you're really trying to make sure that you're doing the right right thing, and you want to be able to kind of adjust the criteria at which an agent is making those decisions in real time and push those things into the kind of operations team's hands, as opposed to having a developer need to run around with its hair on fire, to solve that. But then when we get to the kind of downstream, like sending an email, or in other cases, like updating things like financial statements, these kinds of, it's not heart surgery, but it is, high risk. Like once you send an email, you can't take that back. There's a reputation risk, all of that. That's where, governance motion or governance policies, like when is the agent allowed to do that? What kind of words are allowed to be used? Does it even have access to that account? So agent identity management. When it's kind of building that, content, what sources is it allowed to have and which sources should it not have? All of those pieces, when we start to, think about autonomous agents, they need to be governed. And I think the hard part of that is making governance like easy and a first class kind of organizational tool, as opposed to just something that developers do.
Okay, I think you took a fantastic example there. We can just dig deeper into that. And it's very contextual because as a product company, one of the things we do is sell APIs, say
Mm-hmm.
on AWS Marketplace. And we are a bunch of engineers, so we know some things better than others. And sales is something that doesn't come naturally to us, right? And it's something we're trying to improve as we go. So I know a little bit of what you're talking about there, outreach, and we've used a bunch of tools to have them do it. Just want to share that I do have the context. I'm going to ask you some specific questions about what you mentioned there. The first thing is when you talk about governance there, Logan, tell me where I'm clearly going wrong here, but help me understand that. Everything that you mentioned there about an outreach and what is a high risk, where you mentioned that an email is sent out and maybe the language, the verbiage is not correct and you can pull it back. So those are important things. But is that not the feature of that agent? And in other words, if the agent were built correctly and it was QA'd to the extent that it should have been, then does it mean the governance that we speak of here is not needed? I mean, where do we draw the line between the
Mm.
actual functionality being broken versus governance coming into play?
Well, I think that's where, well designed, even with well designed agents, and I think the sending of the email is a pretty broad example. Another example, it could be, from a governance perspective, data that's coming from a database. And especially when we start to think about RAG and all of this, kind of like retrieval augmented generation. So these are probabilistic, kind of infrastructures, right? Large language models are a probability. And so you might get certain things you might not, on one call, and get different things the next call. And so when we think about agents being well constructed in kind of development and QA'd as you go through, I think the thing that you start to realize as you scale that is there's all these little edge cases that when you're building software kind of deterministically like SaaS, you can, in testing, once you test it, you know that it's going to work the rest of the time. With agents, because there's all these probabilities that are compounding, you need to have governance from the very beginning to the very end with these different guardrails. Like we have, I think, 32 categories now of different policies, dynamic policies that can be injected at different steps inside the kind of agentic workflow or different stages. So yes, you should build your agent so that it sends out the perfect email every time, and that's great. But that 1 in 100,000 time where one a prompt upstream kind of results in a negative tone of an email, and you don't want negative tone of an email going out, you need to have the guardrails in place. And I think that's the really challenging thing with agents is there's so many probabilities involved. Just trusting that you built the agent properly from the get-go, I think it's misguided as you start to scale these things out.
That's another great example. So let me understand that further. So you called out for these agents being more probabilistic than deterministic, right? Meaning traditional software, you test it. If it works, it should most likely work, right? Sure, there's always those nuances where things could
Mm-hmm.
be different, right? Based on the user interactions and inputs that play a role. But with agents, you're saying that's more likely to happen. But let's say, is it because, Logan, the agents are, you mentioned RAG, right? You mentioned, retrieval augmented generation, where it's data that's, it's not just out there in the public world, but it's data in your
Mhm.
repositories per se that play a role in making these judgments and whatnot. Why is it not? Why is it probabilistic? In other words, if the prompts are the same, if the interaction is identical, and if your data is the same, is it, what are some things that are changing that makes this actually more probabilistic than that I'm thinking here?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the kind of work that's going on, right? So I think like when you look at, like, I don't know, have you used Cloud Code?
Yep, I have.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've got, always a couple of Cloud Code agents going, right? And it's like we could have a conversation with Cloud Code. It could be in the README or a skills file or something like this as an example, to, when you're testing this, use this particular URL or something, right? And that could be in the skills file, defined in capital letters. And as it's going through, it might miss something. And so then when you're in an interactive environment, right, you might hit pause, redirect the agent, and then things can be, brought back on course. So that's common when it's an interactive scenario. But when you start to think about it where you're trying to build more and more autonomy, where interactivity can sometimes be a negative, right? The user wants this thing to get completed right every single time. And that's where, I think the more autonomy you bring into it, the more kind of probabilities that something could be missed or some instruction could be misinterpreted, just because the large language models like that. And so the way that, I've always thought about this is, or the other way that's not necessarily guardrails, is things that can be done without an LLM should be done without an LLM, right? So that you do get levels of determinism throughout the process of building the agent.
Okay, that's good. So let's say we go back to the sales example there. How does the agent, let's say somebody created an agent to doing some of those things that you mentioned, right? Being able to curate the contact list, perhaps based on, let's say you're selling one or more products. Like in our case, we have like 4 different products. We need the verbiage to be specific to the product that we are selling. So the contact list is different. It's specific to the product. The verbiage is specific as well. And the workflow, when we have a sequence of what needs to happen, when what gets sent out, whether we are using an automation tool or a large sales automation tool or otherwise, there is a certain method to the madness that we practice. So that's the rules by which, say, we try to do our reach outs at Snowpal. Now let's say we create an agent that does some or all of this. What is, when you have to do governance on your platform, you will have to understand the core objectives of this agent, right? What is the agent actually trying to do? How is it trying to do that? Where is this agent running? And then what are some of the things you need to do to govern this agent? How does that
Yeah,
process work?
I would say that one of the kind of the how and the when and the what, I would call that orchestration, right? So that's where, for Waxell, we have a runtime and a framework for data orchestration, agentic orchestration, all those kinds of things. Where we're where we get into governance is the kind of edge cases, token usage, QA, additional QA, PII, redaction, the kind of error handling, how many errors are acceptable, these kinds of things. And then there's kind of the inference based governance as well. And so when we look at the kind of how and the what, that's really where it's a combination of, this is where the orchestration would be. So it's a combination of large language model based, like, reasoning and skills files and these kinds of things. And then the deterministic stuff, like, when should you send an email to somebody, right? Well, if you just sent an email, if it's the first email, maybe you can send it within 3 days, but then the next email needs to be 5 to 7 days. To me, that's not governance. That's agent creation. Whereas governance is identity, as I said, identity, token usage, all these kinds of things that could be what makes the agent, not be a benefit to your company, but be a liability to your company.
Okay, so the separation there is some of the features that I mentioned really becomes part of the orchestration. But the governance is like you mentioned, when you send this, are you including the last name or maybe their phone numbers that you don't want to be able to include? So what part of the governance is agent specific versus it being generic? Because some of what you mentioned with
Global.
PII is going to be probably applicable to a number of agents. So what are some differences that apply to certain types of agents? Like
Yeah.
how does that break down in your system?
So that's the beautiful thing about Waxell is we have an incredible kind of like scoping ability. So we start with the global scopes, right? So you could set for your agentic fleet, a maximum token budget, a maximum daily spend, have audit policies and all these kinds of things that apply at the global level. Then you can start to scope agents all the way down to the particular agentic identity, which could be, like a proxy to your users, and it could be agent types, etc. So our system allows you to set global policies that every single agent has to follow, and then also, scoping it all the way down to the minutia, to potentially one particular agent, that's been, say, it's been problematic, or a user that you have a special deal with, that you want to exceed the token counts that normal agents run. And so that gives, and so that one of the great things about this is that takes the kind of governance out of the hair of the engineering team, the developer, and brings it into something that can be done either by a developer or by like an operations person who's thinking about not just the code I'm writing, but the organization, our client base, that kind of stuff.
Okay. I think I'm following most of it. So thank you for patiently explaining that. So let's say we created these agents. What does that interaction look like? How do you integrate? Let's say we have three different agents, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Three different AI agents. Now we're going to use your platform to have it govern each of these agents. How does the onboarding experience look like? What are some of the things we have to do, and who does it? What is the typical role of the person that's doing that? And to complete my question there, let's say I have these three agents onboarded onto your platform by however you're going to explain it to us as to how that's done. But do we then go through a sequence of steps that's predefined on your platform that tells us, hey, you know what, these are the things that I want to apply to these agents, these are some things I want to apply to every agent I onboard onto the platform, but there are these other items that are very specific to the type of agent that we're adding to the platform?
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways, and we look at this in a life cycle, from a life cycle standpoint. So the first way is through what we call Waxell Observe, which is an SDK, Python based, that you can easily instrument. So we have auto instrumentation for, I think, 77 different frameworks and tools, everything from Anthropic and OpenAI down to, ChromaDB, vector databases, that kind of stuff. And so the cool thing with Waxell Observe is you can have whatever code base you wrote or whatever kind of frameworks you used, tooling that you use to build your agents. And there's a couple of decorator functions that can be used to instrument it in 5 minutes. Now the kind of collection for that agent has started. There are increasing more granular controls that you can, or granular kind of instrumentation that you can bring into the agent in Waxell Observe, but you don't actually have to change any foundational code on your agent. So once you've implemented Waxell Observe, data collection starts. Maybe you just run a quick local run of that agent, and with that you can start to pass things like specific agent IDs, user IDs, whatever, however you want to identify that agent on the platform. There's a bunch of different options, which then all of those fall into the different scopes that you could have. You could have user groups, subscription tiers, whatever those might be. Super customizable. Once the data collection starts, so after the 5 minutes you add a couple of decorators, you can just pop into the platform. And after a couple runs, you can either build policies manually. You can, we have dashboards. You can see costs. You can see all the crazy data. It's unbelievable. But what we've done, because we have this awesome agentic framework, is we built agents that can recommend policies for you to control what you have going on. And we also have an agent that can tell you what's going on with your fleet, all the way down to what model is consuming the most cost, what agents seem to be, having anomalies, all of that kind of stuff. So you instrument the agent with Waxell Observe, takes a couple of minutes, you come into the platform, you've got unbelievable amounts of data, dashboards, all of that. But then you have a couple of agents that can actually help you use it. I got to be honest, I never actually look at the dashboards. I just use our agent to help me figure out what's going on.
you know I'm going to be, hopefully we're able to imagine a lot of this, right? Obviously if you see the product, a lot of this will become intuitive, but now I think we're just going to have to imagine what you're saying, which I think we can to a large extent. Perhaps I should have asked you before we hit record whether we should have done a demo, because that would be quite useful as well. So you explained that very clearly as to how this onboarding might happen. Who does this, like from a role standpoint in an organization? There is somebody who's creating these, building these agents. Is that the same person that's typically configuring those agents on your platform, or is that a different role that you see in companies that's doing this?
Engineers build the agents, right? So they can build the agent with intent, right? I want the agent to do this thing. They instrument it with Waxell's tooling, which, as I said, very, very quick to do. They can either be the ones building out the kind of policies and the governance and tracking the cost per agent, the cost per user, all of the cool data that we provide. Typically, though, that's not where the engineer or developer likes to spend their time. They want to go build the next feature. They kick off the kind of governance side of things, the analytics side, to an operations person. And so one of the beautiful things about Waxell is that it really allows the kind of operations and business minded people the ability to influence the behavior of agents as they need to, without having to knock on the engineer's door every time they want to update something or fix something. Or one of the cool things we have is a kill switch, so if things are going really haywire, we don't need to go wake up the engineer at 2 o'clock in the morning to turn things off. We can just institute a kill switch and none of the agents will run.
Okay. And so that gives us a good picture into the product and its functionality. Can we sort of shift gears to the technology stack, because a lot of our audience is in the space of being, they're developers, architects, and folks are running companies of different sizes. So can you speak to some things that you are able to share with us, Logan? We'd appreciate you sharing the architecture of your product essentially, and how it is, like if you were to have built this, let's say a year or two ago versus now. What are some things that you see change in your architecture and your technology stack, at least some organically and some seismically, based on everything that's changing? I mean, you could talk about how some of the team members in your team are actually building your software. I mean, is it vibe coding versus are they traditional developers like we were like 2 or 3 years ago? To what does your technology stack actually look like, and how different do you think it is from what you might have had if this were done like a few years ago?
Yeah, so like from a high level stack perspective, we're kind of Python. We use things like Django on the back end, and then Next.js on the front end, and big like AWS shop. We got a lot of Kubernetes and Fargate kind of all over the place. As far as like the development process and that kind of stuff, we obviously were, or not obviously, but we were pretty stoked when ChatGPT 3.5 could almost get things right. They could at least get us a little bit further down the path quicker. But what's interesting now is the kind of power of agentic coding. With we've been touching this code base for so long that, like, having the agentic coding process with already a deep knowledge in what's going on in the platform, that it's just exploded our progress towards where we are today. And then I think the last piece in what's changed is what we thought an agent was and could do 9 months ago versus what an agent can do now, based on both the kind of increase in context window size as well as just sitting with these things and having better models to deal with. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Okay. And you mentioned AWS there. What are some of the products, AWS AI specific products that you are currently using?
So, I mean, we use Bedrock, but other than that, that's just about the only AWS, kind of AI product that we use. Now, we use a lot of open source, uh, AI products. One of the things that when we talk about kind of checking quality and checking if like in governance, like if intellectual property or these kinds of things are going to leak into prompts and that, we realized we really needed to build like private models and really get good at hosting those and all of that kind of stuff. So we don't, we try to use in the Waxell side of things as few kind of mass marketed models or kind of frontier models as possible, because what we're doing is not at that level. That's where our clients are living, or our users are living, right? So yeah, long answer to a short question, but we're not other than a little bit of bedrock, not a lot else on the AI side with AWS.
Okay, and then you mentioned the onboarding earlier. Let's say once we have these agents, we want to onboard them onto your platform. Is that typically, like, if you have to be specific about the sequence of steps that happens there, Logan? Is it done through? You mentioned you have a Next.js, a React user interface, right? Does it happen primarily through that, or is that one of the options to onboard these agents onto your platform?
Yeah, so the cool thing when we look at Waxel Observe is it's almost all done. So the first piece is, you sign up, you get your API key. Then you're just adding the API key into your .env file and instrumenting the agent in at the code level. And then that's syncing, that's sending the telemetry up into into our platforms. It's an open telemetry backed, telemetry system, and so that's kind of shipping that into the Waxel platform where there's server side enrichment and all that. So it's really instrument the code, and then you've got your beautiful dashboards and kind of AI agents that are helping you make good decisions on how to govern these things. Yeah, good.
Sure. And how do you react to what's happening? Like, let's say if I want to visually look at what's going on, I might log into the dashboard every so often, but I'm sure your customers are automating that as well, right? Let's say an email was sent out, perhaps with PII or something bad happened, right? And your agent, how does your system notify your customers as to what transpired and what could the customers possibly do as a, not as in a proactive mode, so it can actually recover from things that actually didn't go right?
Yeah. So uh, we have kind of three modes of policy checking. First, we have pre-execution policy checking, and then there's mid-execution, which would happen at like tool calls, large language model calls, these kinds of things. And then we have post. Pre-execution, we're basically looking at, is the agent allowed to be, run? Are the kind of tools configured properly? All this kind of stuff. The mid execution is really where the magic happens, right? So before something, before PII goes into, as an example, goes into a prompt that, would be going off to Anthropic, which is a nightmare. The pre check is going to look at that. And then we have modes. So that would create what we call an execution incident. And there's a few modes. There's warn, block, and then specific to the redact, or specific to the PII, kind of like prompt specific governance, we have redact. So we could just literally either warn and say, hey, this is happening, and let it go through. Maybe that's a token issue, these kinds of things. It could block it and say, this happened, agent's gone, send a page to, we have Slack, email, webhook, whatever that might be. And then, on the redact, it might just, take that PII, turn it into hashes, pound signs or whatever, and then let it go through into the prompt. And so with that, you have control over, okay, do I just want to know that this particular thing is happening? Maybe on the cost side, like I know that I'm 80% of my budget, and maybe get a couple of alerts as you're approaching that. On things that are a little bit more high risk, maybe that just blocks the execution and alerts the team, which then allows the team to come in. And then we have all the logs and all of the kind of traces, and that can be then looked at. So you're not going through server logs to try to figure out exactly what happened 3 hours ago. You have all of that telemetry right in front of you and an agent that can help you understand what might have happened.
Okay, that's helpful to know. And you mentioned hooks there. What are some of the hooks that you support? You mentioned web hooks. So there's a way to register these hooks. So if something happened, there is a way for your system to reach out to your customers' services essentially, right? What are some of the hooks that you support and how do they actually work? If you could just go into some detail.
Yeah, so each policy can be configured to have a few different notifications. Like for us, when you have one agent or maybe three agents and you're just starting, you really start with like the observability. Okay, what's going on? What's my cost, right? Okay, now I can see like on Mondays I spend a lot of money, on Wednesdays I spend less, and I kind of understand where I don't want to surpass. So in the first place might be, okay, I'm going to have a budget policy. And so then it's like, all right, at 70% of my budget policy for the week, I want to be alerted. So maybe that's just an email to people. Then, say at 90%, maybe that sends a webhook to a backend that, maybe it means that the task that triggers agents or something gets governed on your side, just as an example. So all of our notifications can be kind of set to have different, or all of our policies can be set to have different thresholds at which different notifications run. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. I think what I was trying to ask more specifically was, let's say if something happened, right? Your system detected that a certain condition happened, correct? Whatever that
Mhm.
happens to be. Can we register like maybe RESTful interfaces so you can make a call or maybe a message broker where you send a message to this destination so we can react to that? I was just trying to understand what are
Yeah.
some of
Oh,
those hooks
yeah.
looking like?
Yeah. Yeah. So right now it's really focused on email and webhooks, and the webhooks are kind of the key, and we're kind of exploring other messaging systems, queues, and all these kinds of things that we might integrate in the future.
Okay, with the webhooks currently, would that be what does the payload look like? Would you be sending like a JSON
Yeah.
payload with the
Yeah.
details that we okay.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and essentially just for the benefit of our audience, you have a JSON schema that defines what that message structure is going to look like, right? That way the systems that are consuming it know what to
Yeah.
expect and how to react based on what's coming through.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's got, it's the same structure every single time. There just might not be, certain data each time. So then the logic for the developer building out the receiver, it'll be the same every time, and they can handle it, logically on their side.
And how does the pricing work on your side? Like at the highest level, how do there's many different interactions that you could possibly have that you mentioned here, levels of configuration, what kind of governance you want to be able to do. Of course, how many agents is the starting point, right? It's going to cost more for 10 versus one. But even within a single agent, what are some parameters that add to the cost of you
Hmm.
monitoring those agents, right? If you could speak to
Hmm.
some of them.
Yeah. So it's really the kind of levers that we see are trace volume and policies, kind of on the I would say like the starter level. But then we have enterprise, kind of options like data location, bring your own key on the KMS side, the kind of like what an enterprise might need to plug this kind of thing in. So really, it comes down to we have a very generous kind of starter package. I forget exactly how many traces. And then it's really, once you have lots and lots of traces, then the price starts to go up. And then it's the policies that are active is the other level.
Okay. And the last question that sends is, to understand a product or a platform, Logan, there's many ways to do that. One of the ways I've done it in the past is just to look to see what features that the product or the platform supported, let's say a few months ago, versus what it supports today. Because what it does support in future, that's part of your private roadmap, right? Not everybody's
Mm-hmm.
privy to that. The only way to tell how a product or a platform is progressing, even for what we sell,
Mm-hmm.
that's how people can have a takeaway. So if you have to go back to say 3 months ago or 6 months ago, what were some things that you did not have or support at that time that you do support now? Because that'll give us an indication to how we could extrapolate this to see what's coming in future.
Yeah. So about 3 months ago, we supported, I think it was like 15 or 16 like frameworks and different open source packages, basically what we were used to using. And about 60 days ago, we made an internal kind of policy that everybody needs to. We built a huge list of the ecosystem of all the open source, all the paid for platforms, and we said everybody needs to build complex agents. Not just like I have a demo agent with this on all of these putting things together like Legos, right? And then as we start to validate these, then we'll say we support them. And so now we're up to I think it's about 177 different auto instrumented frameworks and packages and databases and all of this kind of stuff. Now we have kind of a monitoring system as we see something that maybe we don't auto instrument right now. Uh, we basically go build agents with it, and we've got a lot of agents that we've built. It's easy. If there's a new vector database platform, we can go swap it out, build it out. So that's kind of our internal, drive, is to just support in the easiest way possible for developers the auto instrumentation for as many frameworks and platforms and large language model providers, all of that that we can.
Okay. And if you could speak to the metadata of the agents that are onboarded on your system, and what I mean by that is, given all of your customers and all of the agents that you're supporting, you now have an idea as to, okay, these are the most popular agents, right? This is what most people seem to be doing versus ones that are not so popular. And that's one. And the second part of the question is, what are some common problems that you've seen with the more common types of agents that you've seen onboarded onto your system?
Yeah. I mean, see a lot of like LangChain, Llama Index, like the OpenAI SDK, Anthropic SDK. I think there's definitely the kind of tier one most popular, and then it starts to really scatter from there. The thing that I don't get to see everybody's agents, but the more I talk to people, is it really feels like a lot of the agents that are built and even pushed to prod and operating on prod data, I think we will look at them in 6 to 12 to 18 months and say those were experiments that were parading around as production software. It's insane the kind of what we would allow as a SaaS product to be launched versus what we're getting, with agents in prod right now.
Okay, and we got like about 8 minutes to go. Last few questions, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask me anything. Where do you see this go in the next 3 to 6 months? Right? I mean, you're lock, stock, and barrel in that space. As I talk to people, you've gone from building web applications or any application for that matter for humans to building them with agents in mind. Right? I mean, that's the future. Looks like it's not just humans consuming these services and products, but it's actually agents doing some of those interactions and agent to agent interactions as well. So if you were to could see the crystal ball, Logan, where do you see this go in the next 3 to 6 to 12 months, and how fast do you see things change?
So I think like there's we got like agent to agent communication. There's all these like cool functionalities that agents could do, and so we could keep building functionality to agents. I think one of the things that excites me the most is how we're starting to change the systems that us as like engineers and developers are used to, right? So like you talk to like Stainless, which is the docs and SDK site there, and this I believe heavily in this. They're building their documentation sites, which used to be the most boring kind of parts of any piece of software, into things that could be easily understood by agents, right? MCPs. So instead of building a bunch of like REST APIs that my users could integrate with, it's all about MCPs and building like secure ways that their co-work local agent could get this data. So it's like, I think for the cool stuff that's being built in the agent space, at least my opinion is, for that to get adopted heavily, we need to be building so that our kind of customers and clients and end users, their agents can consume that data the easiest. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's how we see the kind of idea of adoption, especially for dev tools, is make it easy for an agent to figure it out, and then you move fast.
And what are some potential pitfalls that you see in the near future, at least? Hopefully things get ironed out as we all learn more about all of these things. But in the near term to short term, Logan, what are some things that you think might actually go wrong, or you're actually seeing go wrong, and people being reactive to those types of things?
I think the Claudebot, kind of storyline is basically like a daily dose of everything that could go wrong if you just let agents run amok, right? I think there's security problems. I think there's massive issues with, these agents running locally, having access to files, deleting files, these kinds of things. So I really think like the reason that I'm so bullish on governance and the market isn't, necessarily like thinking about it every day like we are, but they will, because I think the more access you give agents, the more kind of autonomy you give agents, it really is Pandora's box. And so, I think like as the Claudebot project, unfolds and we see, the token costs running up to $2,000 overnight, people's credit card information getting, shared with the world. It's like those are the pitfalls. And when you start to translate that into business applications, that gets really hard to think about a systems admin ever being okay with agents running on your network. And so I think those are the I think barriers to agents really truly replacing meaningful work in an autonomous way.
Okay, my last question to you, and then let you ask me anything you want to ask me, is slightly different from our conversation, but yet related. What do you think is the impact on enterprise software? Because, the last month or 2 months, or even the last 6 months, you look at all the companies that are in that space, like Salesforce, Workday, Adobe, the list goes on, right? Intuit, for instance, they've all taken a hit in the market, right? I mean, their share prices are like, the stock price is like one third sometimes. They've dropped a lot of value, like companies like Atlassian or Monday, project management tools. So, what do you see happen to the future of enterprise software? I mean, they call it the, what is it? The
SaaSpocalypse.
Sasocalypse,
So,
right? Exactly,
yeah.
right? So, what is your take on that, Luke?
I think we saw this, like we launched our sales engagement tool as like a piece of software that helped people generate, content, and your kind of like your utilization is based on when somebody logs in each time. Once we turned this into agents, it was really, you know, the utilization of our, servers and platform and everything was always maxed out, right? Because the agents are always running. And so if these software companies build interfaces for agents to work with them, then why would a company, vibe code HubSpot? That's insane, right? Like that's crazy. So if they can have their agent working with HubSpot or working with Intuit or, you know, those companies are trusted entities and for good reason. So I think software, as the publicly traded stuff, is fine as long as they don't even need to become agentic. They just need to make it easy for agents to consume and do work on their platform in a safe manner, right? And so I don't see stuff disappearing. I think it's just, we need to change the interface.
I couldn't agree more. Just to add to what you mentioned there, it's like, it's analogous to saying, we could cook, all of us could cook food in the house. So there's no need for restaurants, right? I mean, that's an argument one could make, because you can make food in the house, but you go there because it's convenient. Sometimes you want to have a good time, whatever that means. So perhaps enterprise software, each of these companies has proven to be good at whatever it is that they have been doing. And like you said, that maybe the way you interact with them, maybe the integration is going to change, but that does not negate the whole need for those companies. But it does feel like it, because day in and day out, like every day, I see, like, say, CRM as a stock, even on a good day. Like today, I think the market was doing all right. I mean, they go up, if I remember correctly, and then the end of the
Yeah.
day, one more time they take a dip, right? So it's been going down
Yeah.
and down and down and down. So it sounds like, okay, there's no end to this fall.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they've had a good run. But yeah, I think it'll the restaurant analogy was awesome because like you also go to a restaurant because they just make the food better than you, right?
Right.
Like I can make a steak not as good as the guy at the steakhouse. So yeah,
And not only that, right, by virtue of you letting someone else make the steak, you actually have the time and
Yeah.
resource available to doing something else that you actually want to be doing. Maybe not, you're not in the business of cooking steaks, right? So why would you do
Right.
that just because you could vibe your way, vibe code your way to actually possibly doing that, for instance, right?
Right, right. Which is like one of the foundational like reasons for trade that you learn in economics 101, right? Don't do everything just because you can. Do what you're good at and let somebody else do. I mean, that's what trade is. So like the whole idea
Finding
that SaaS is going to go away just is like it defies the physics of business. So yeah, it's crazy.
Okay, thank you so much. Any questions that you have for me that I can answer?
Well, I'm pretty one track mind how agents are used, how other business leaders are thinking about agents in their business. So I'd love to understand where you guys are on your journey with agents, at Snowplow.
Sure, I can tell you. I mentioned to you, right? One of the products we have is APIs, right? We create these APIs like horizontal APIs and some vertical. We were starting to work on a fintech API, for instance, currently, and we publish that on primarily on AWS Marketplace. But you can license our APIs if you want to run them in your own infrastructure as well. But up until now, it's going to change soon. But up until now, the way you interact with them is even if whether or not you purchase a license or use them by usage on AWS, you have a RESTful interface that you integrate essentially,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have all of these
Mm-hmm.
endpoints defined. We have thousands of endpoints and you have to consume them. And that was literally meant for humans to understand and do it, right? And you mentioned the pain in creating this documentation, API documentation. As you know, when you have 8 APIs with thousands of endpoints, it's not a pleasurable thing to do. Nobody wants to do it. There's a lot of challenges as a smaller company in spending time doing it. So one of the few things that we are starting to work on as well is adding the model context protocol, the MCP tier on top. And you actually alluded to that earlier, right? Like Rogan, where agents are not going to be calling these RESTful endpoints to consuming your services, but agents are going to actually go through an MCP tier to actually consume the services that you provide. So one of the things that we are doing is trying to implement that tier like an MCP
Cool.
server for our APIs. At the same time, building the next API, which is going to be we are a polyglot shop, but a lot of our APIs are on Golang, for instance. Language and technology is one thing, but how it fits into the overall realm of where we deploy them, for instance, right? Like we use AWS for the most part, right? Predominantly. But as more companies come into play to be able to host your products and solutions, one of the things, for what it's worth, even if it's outside your question, I would say is the default choice has not become one of these three big hyperscalers anymore. We use AWS a lot and sometimes Google Cloud or Azure, and the other companies that use one of these other hyperscalers. But as I talk to more people, it sounds to me like probably why a lot of these companies are losing cloud market share. There are other providers, right? The only question is whether they're all going to be in service and existence 2 years down the road. But the default choice has not become one of these three big companies, which might explain
Mm-hmm.
why Amazon's AWS has lost their market share from like 50% like 2 years ago or something to like under 38% today, right? So a lot of the reason I also asked about some of the technology that you're using is we're seeing our technology stack change seismically, right? I mean, other than the fact that if you're building UI, you might use Next.js and React frameworks and whatnot. Otherwise, the whole architecture of what we are doing is beginning to look very different. Even from the choice of databases, right? It's not like Mongo. It's not SQL versus no SQL anymore, right? You talked about a little bit about vector databases. How do you
Yeah.
use vector databases? What vector database do you want to be able to use? And how does it make sense in the context of what you're building currently? And how does it retrospectively fit into your existing stack? Because you don't have the luxury of changing everything you've done dramatically as well, right? So a lot of those things there's no dearth of challenges as a company, but that's at least some of them that's on the table for us to resolve.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny you say that, especially with like agents, like long running agents, right? You can't just run them like you would, asynchronous task. Like we've done a lot of work with, like AWS Fargate, like running these ephemeral tasks that can, spin off ephemeral tasks. So it's like Docker is almost used in this like interesting new way with like big agentic workflows. So yeah, it's a everything is changing all the time at like light speed right now. It's crazy.
And then I think software engineering, it's never been a static space, right? Over the years, I've been building software for like 2 decades now. It's always been changing. But it's one thing for frameworks and libraries to change because you, as a developer, you adapt to them quick enough because you've seen that happen plentifully over the years. But I think the change now is more seismic, right? The
Mm-hmm.
fundamentals are changing. How do you even build? Like, do you even need a developer to build software, right? Not anymore. I mean, that's a big change. Over the years, you needed a developer to write code, to build software. Now people are like, hey, do I need a developer or do I not need a developer for whatever it is that I'm doing, right? So the questions are being asked from the get go, which
Yeah.
means we are in this, it's a moment of reckoning, if you will, right? I mean, there's no denying that essentially. Really
Yeah.
appreciate all of your thoughts there, Logan. Any closing comments to our audience before we call it wraps? And please hang on for a minute after we are done.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I feel like I just talked for an hour, so I think I'm good.
Okay, no worries. Again, appreciate you sharing the specifics of your platform and the product. And at least I'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile and Waxell AI, so our audience can certainly check out the product, see, take their agents to your platform, and then check out the features of governance and orchestration and whatnot. That's all I have, Logan. Just hang on for a minute after. But thank you so much for taking time to share your knowledge in this space.
Thanks a lot.